Hey folks, just a little intro here today. I'm sorry I don't have a lot of time to do a full intro. I've been way behind the 8 ball on this stuff this week, and hopefully I can catch up soon. But I've got some good content for you here. First, I've got the interview with Chris Tanner, where we kind of just talk about the book Work, which he has, and which is from, I think he said it's from CrimethInc. And then in the second half, I talked to Justin for Red Reviews number 5, and we talk about the book The Deficit Myth, which discusses the modern monetary theory. I hope that you enjoy both of those, and if you want the full-length interview and the full-length book review, just make sure to email me, or you can go become a patron where they will be posted at patreon.com/skepticalleftist. And beyond that, yeah, I don't have much to say today. I hope this finds you well, and I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast that covers progressive politics, left-wing philosophy, and critical thinking by talking to a variety of people. Today I'm joined by Chris Tanner from the Cellar Door Skeptics podcast and YouTube show.
And you, yep.
Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you, especially when it comes to topics that may even be too liberal for my show. And I only say that for those, if you've never tuned into Cellar Door Skeptics, I am the resident left. Even though I'm from America, I'm typically the farthest left person on there. So sometimes it's kind of funny because people will, they'll be like, "Oh man, I can't stand your show," and I was like, "I'm going on a show that's more left than mine, so works for me."
Yeah, I guess, It is odd that they would say that, because I mean, even I guess maybe it's just my bias. Like, I think of everything as like the left is so obvious. All the things that we advocate for are, good things that everybody should want. So
it's a weird identity to have to say I'm a progressive, right? Like I don't understand sometimes the logic in having to say I'm progressive, I'm a leftist. Like, I have to give you my identity stance for my political beliefs because A, there's a lot that goes into it, and B, there's so many other people that don't understand what a leftist is. Like, technically, I don't identify as a leftist. Like, technically, I don't say I'm a leftist because it's just this muddled water that people don't understand what it is. And then I'm spending an hour discussing. It's just easier to tell you what I support and what I don't support.
Yeah.
Then you can label me however the fuck you want. Excuse the language.
Yeah, no worries. The nice thing about this show is that that's kind of part of the point, is that we are diving into that. What is a leftist and what counts this way or that way? And what do we all believe? Where do we divide? So I guess to start off with that, like, first, what's a little bit of your background? What's something about you that people need to know?
So I have a very convoluted background. I originally grew up in a ultra conservative Christian household. So, a lot of my upbringing was Rush Limbaugh. That's what I listened to as a kid. I knew who Hannity was before probably many people that listened to your show did. And I don't say that lightly because I didn't always agree with the beliefs, but that's what I was fed. My father has been a staunch Republican. My father grew up, and I guess short story long, my father grew up pretty poor. By today's standards, they were extremely poor. Both his father and his mother worked full time, and they still could barely make ends meet. They were not ultra rich until later on in their life. So my father grew up, and I'll tell you a story to give you kind of perspective of my father, because my father dictates my upbringing, which is me essentially leaving my upbringing and uprooting everything I believed in, everything. But my father grew up where on Sunday they would go to church and they would invite people that were less fortunate than them home to their house for lunch, and they made the kids wait to eat until everybody else ate.
Okay.
So if their stew ran out, your kids didn't get to eat. Now, my father said that very rarely ever happened. There was always plenty of food, but instead of eating like a fried chicken meal, his mother would slaughter a chicken, at some point. And they would bake the chickens, and then they would chop it up and put it in soup and with vegetables, because that meal was, in our day standard, that's a $10 meal, right? Back then it's probably a $1 meal, or whatever. But if fed, it could feed all these people. And his parents were very dedicated to helping people at his church receive, right? But when you take politics versus humanism, and I call that humanism, even though I'm an atheist now, I still call that humanism. That's humanistic Christianity. When I grew up, we did not grow up, I was not poor. I thought I was poor. My parents led me to believe we were poor. We used to do paper routes as kids all the time on Sunday. So we would go to church in the morning for Sunday school. Then we would have normal church. Then we go deliver paper routes. Then we would go to a restaurant, like an Olive Garden. Nothing super fancy, but every week we went. It was never a question. I went to a parochial school. My parents shelled out thousands of dollars a year for me and my siblings to go to a parochial school. It was essentially a Christian reform school. So they were not super conservative, but they were definitely not liberal. Put it that way. You got to think that's the 90s too. So between the late 80s, early 90s, Christians were all kind of one big group. There wasn't a bunch of Christians that were like, oh, it's okay to be gay, or you can look at porn today as long as you do it in the bathroom. There was none of
Christian conservatism was kind of just one thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was the Billy Grahams of the world, that those type of people are some of those people are the, like, what I grew up on, like Focus on the Family. I don't know if you know what Focus on the Family is.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah.
But
I grew up with that.
For listeners, what is Focus on the Family? In case they don't know.
So Focus, and if there's a podcast everybody should listen to called Behind the Bastards. And I give credit to my wife for getting me into this podcast. And I don't listen every week, but Robert Evans is a genius. And basically he picks out people that are bastards. So Focus on the Family originally started as a Christian outreach group. And it was not political at all. It was meant to just be a show. It was just meant to put stuff on the airwaves that was to give you an alternative to secular media. It turned into a huge political movement. And that gentleman that ran that was the largest Christian lobbyer to people like Bush, Clinton, Bush Jr., those people. He was super influential. He's the one that pushed and got conservative Christian politics in the mainstream. Everybody has that fucking asshole to think. But when we grew up, it was typically like they'd have this thing called Odyssey, which was a kids' hour, and it would be storytelling that always had a positive Christian viewpoint. Like, Billy stole from your local grocery store. This is what the parents are going to do, and this is what the kid learned, and oh my God, you could go to hell, and you could end up in jail for the rest of your life.
Right.
Or if you're black, you end up dead. Depending on which country you live in.
Of course, that part probably wasn't mentioned that much.
Mm-hmm. No, and most of the characters were not black either. They were almost all consistently white, and they would have their one token minority that would show up once in a while. But we would, and I don't know, do you know what Chick-fil-A is? Yep. Okay. Do you guys have those in Canada?
We do not.
Okay, so good. Count yourself lucky. In America, I didn't know. This was just a restaurant chain we went to that was better than Wendy's as kids.
Okay.
But they gave you a free Odyssey tape, like once a month or something like that. They would have these like little cassette. That dates me too, because cassette tape. But it goes in your Walkman. You can listen to it anywhere. And we would collect those. My sister still has all of the tapes from when we were kids. I don't know if she could play them, but we have them all, or she does.
Right. There's no machines out there that work.
There probably is, but we don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
So if you want to understand, that was my upbringing. My father was always aggressively against, Clinton. If you're a Democrat, he doesn't care. We were against it. And in high school, I transitioned to a public school for my high school years because my dad took a pay cut so we could move back to Michigan, and they couldn't afford to put all of us in a private school. So it's like, well, the older two they've already had their indoctrination. We don't need to do this anymore. So we went to a public school, which then just like, boosh, you know, like my eyes became open, and all of a sudden it's like, well, people don't always agree with me. And I went to a conservative fucking high school, but they were still more liberal than me. And I met some friends, and my friend was not openly gay or openly bisexual, or he's never actually identified himself, but I know probably the smartest way to define it is pansexual.
Okay.
That's probably the smartest way to define it, because I know, like, he won't give a sexual orientation. He doesn't identify in the LGBTQ community. So, like, that's probably the closest thing that you could give him. But growing up, him and his mother actually always would lecture me. I would say something, and his mother's like, all right, let's have a conversation. Why do you like Rush Limbaugh? Well, because of this. Well, do you understand there's a lot of people that are less fortunate than you, Chris? You're driving your father's car. You got in a car wreck, and your father bought a new car, and you're driving. In my world, we don't have that kind of money. So if Matt gets in an accident, there's no money for him. We're not getting a new car.
We just don't have a car.
Yeah, we're just screwed.
Yeah.
And so in my high school days, I started to transition. Like, I started to have issues with the faith to begin with. And all of it, honestly, the largest portion of it started with the LGBTQ movement. Like, me relating to somebody and then talking to my pastor or my associate pastor about it. And when they were like, well, you should just be friends with them and bring them to youth group, I was like, well, they don't like it. They're atheists. They don't believe in this. And they're saying some things that don't make sense, that make sense, that don't make sense in scripture. And by the time I was 18, I left the church. I was done and over. I still was a moderate conservative, but then I started to get into like Hinduism and Buddhism. And then all of a sudden their teachings are like, oh, well, you should be working with the environment. You should be helping humanity. We're against capitalism. And it took me, I don't know, I would say another 10 years to move from being a conservative to like a moderate to farther left. Okay. So then you can fast forward. I'm 30. I'll be 38 this year. So you fast forward all the way through this into that dynamic. And what happens is I started doing my own research. I've ran a podcast of some sorts for the last 7 years in some capacity. And that's what got me into politics, actually, and becoming an activist a little bit more and wanting to help change things. And my first political movement I was ever involved with was a pro-choice movement and a decriminalized marijuana movement. And some of it's a little selfish on my behalf for both of those, because I used to be the guy that protested at the clinics. So I feel I owe a recompense, quite a bit of recompense. That's fair. For my upbringing and stuff like that. And then the marijuana one was because I smoked a lot of pot. I smoked pot, and I didn't understand why these things are happening. And then that's actually what opened my whole eyes into understanding why the criminal justice system is meant to restrict minorities, why it is meant to keep black people down, why it's meant to keep poor people poor. And then everything just kind of went from there. Right. Yeah.
It's one of those things. Once the evidence starts rolling in, you stop being able to deny it, and starts, wow, geez, the system is pretty fucked up.
Yeah. It's insane. And, you know, the funny thing, Corey, is that a lot of people don't want all of that in their lives. And the one thing, and I'll say one positive thing about Trump, I can't say much, but I can say one positive thing is he pushed himself into the media frame to the point where conservatives and moderates had to give a fuck about voting. Like, it actually happened, which, like, who thought Trump would be the one that would overthrow this whole, like start to actually change our democracy? Like, that is not something I ever would have thought.
No, for sure not. Especially considering, like, so much of his rhetoric was intended to, like, he, like, had the theme of going back in time and going back to a time when you didn't have to care about politics because everything was perfect for upper middle class white people.
Yeah. Well, and that's hence, you know, you invited me on the show to have a conversation about this book, and I'm going to show everybody the book, and I'll give you the links so you can post them. I found the links where you can buy it, and I don't recommend buying it on Amazon. if you're going to spend the money, buy it directly from their website, and we can explain later why. But the name of the book is Work, and it's by a group called CrimethInc. And I don't know, you probably can't see. Yeah, you might be able to see that. Barely.
I can't really see it from here, but maybe if it's on a full screen, it.
Yeah. So, but it's this doesn't have a specific author, but now I lost my train of thought. But the whole point of us coming on here is to talk about why work is restrictive, why it has all these other things, why we need to move to a different direction. And people like Trump, like, got people inspired. They're not going to go and join my campaign to essentially have us live in a socialist utopia, right? They will never do that. But these principles can be applied to how we're going to break the system down. How do we deteriorate some of these walls? And Trump was this weird little, like, inoculation for some people where people just woke up and were like, whoa, hold on a second.
Now we have to get involved in some level. Yeah.
Which, again, like, I'll be honest, I've told this story on my show before, but the night Trump was elected, I watched an inauguration. My wife went to bed. She's like, I'm done with this. Chris Han and I had been podcasting for a while, but it didn't look like he was going to win. It was too close to call against Hillary. So he hopped off. I should have taken the next day off, but I continued to drink and smoke weed. And by 3 a.m, I'm sitting in my boxers crying at the TV, because all of a sudden all these CNNs and CNBCs are like, we don't want to say it's going to go to Trump, but we feel it's swinging his direction.
Really got to call it.
And by 4 a.m, I'm wasted and devastated, and I'm sitting here, I'm fucking Facebooking in the middle of the night. These just stupid things you shouldn't do when you're inebriated. And I had to get up and go to work the next morning. So I passed out on the couch, crawled into bed, then slept for 3.5 hours, drank a bunch of coffee and an energy drink, went into work late. Like, I just texted my boss. I'm like, I'm going to be late. I had a pretty cushy job at that point anyway, hence what we could talk about in a minute. But, I went into work late, and then, I showed up, and I wasn't the boss, but I was one of the top tier people in that part of the organization, in that middle management. And I come in and I'm hungover as shit. I got my hat on, sunglasses, walking through a warehouse. I'm so hungover, it's not even funny. First person that comes up to me, he goes, hey, guess what day it is? And I was like, it's Wednesday. It's 2 days before Friday. He's like, no, it's Trump Day today. And I take my glasses off and I look him in the eye and I said, I'm going to tell you one thing. It's not fucking Trump Day. We're not all excited about it. I despise this. I feel you're a racist and everything he stands for is a racist. And you could say what you want, but if you don't shut the fuck up because we don't all believe the same thing you do, I'll report your ass to HR without going to your manager. Like, I'm not going to even, I'm just bypassing. I'll go right to HR. So if it was me, I'd shut the fuck up about that. You want to go celebrate on your break? Go do it. But don't come up to me because I'm a fucking liberal and I hate that cocksucker. And that dude's like, oh man, see, look at all these salty tears. And again, personally, I should have just decked him and lost my job. But, then I can't afford to feed my family. But
no, that's right. You got to weigh these things. You got to weigh these things against each other.
You do. You do. And some of me said that very loudly, openly, because I know there was other people that in that organization that were as upset as I was.
Right.
Like, it was not just me. So some of it was me using my privilege, A, as a white man, and B, as a manager of some sorts, to weigh my power in to say, shut the fuck up before this goes any farther. Because you're going to say it to like a low level employee who may not care and he may knock you out. Like, like I didn't say that, but I'm sitting here thinking like nobody else wants to hear this. Just do your job. That's what you're paid to do.
Or, I mean, I don't know your company, but it's the kind of thing like if somebody says that to a member of our marginalized community, they know like, okay, well now I don't feel safe at work. Right. Because this person is one of these pro-Trump guys who thinks that I don't deserve the same rights as he does. So,
yep. Well, and that is a big thing. And I actually have argued within our company that more than you can imagine because of that, because people don't see those things. And so, and like, it's like, hey, I know you don't all support the same views I do, but can we at least not try to alienate other employees? That's all I care.
That's right.
You know, none of us want to be here. Trust me. If we could make the same amount of money we made without actually having to work, we would not physically fucking be here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So I guess before we get into the book, like you've kind of mentioned that you don't call yourself a liberal or a leftist. You kind of identify with liberal politics. Is that technically your brand? Is that your identity as a political identity?
So I have two. I'm going to tell you, I have two political identities, and I am a democratic socialist.
Okay.
On the far level, I'm pretty far to that side, and then I'm also a social anarchist, a socialist anarchist. You could call me whatever you want, but essentially, I'm to some extent an anarchist. The democratic socialist part of me understands. Because I've been in business for so long and because society operates like a business, whether we like it or not, I understand what it takes to some extent to get through to those sides. But the social anarchist in me is okay if tomorrow the stock market collapsed in America, everybody lost their pensions, everybody lost their savings, and that's me included. I'm not.
And suddenly we have to rethink everything.
Yes. And it meant basically the guy next door and you are become the same. And then people want to covet your stuff and steal, and it's going to turn into anarchy. I'm actually okay on a short-term portion with anarchy, 100%. And that's a view most people don't share with me. I'm very aggressively anarchist in that aspect. But I will tell you that once anarchy has run its course and done what it needs to do, we need to move back away from that edge, because anarchy is as close to libertarian as you can be, with no regulation.
Yeah, it depends on what definition you're using of anarchy, right? Because a lot of anarchist philosophers believe in a type of a system of running society. We just don't believe in the state as an entity, because the entity that is the state almost always becomes corrupted in some way and ends up like oppressing people in order to keep power and wealth in the hands of a few.
Yes. Yep. And I believe the same thing. I just do not believe in running in a current state of ultimate anarchy. I believe there has to be some sort of a control mechanism to help perpetuate and move this forward. And I'm not the guy that you should be elected. That's not me. I'll be here to support other people, but I'm not the guy you want to elect, especially in America.
Yeah, it would depend. Again, it just depends on the system that ends up in place, right? Like a lot of people with anarchist systems would have like short-term elected representatives that are easily recallable, and everybody would have kind of a term as that representative depending on their industry or their region and stuff like that. Like, it's just like, depends on which system you really want to follow through with, but there's a lot of good ideas out there.
And see, in my world, like that's where if you can define anarchy in that manner and allow anarchy to have a social construct of some sort, like in that, like just how you described it, then sure, you can call me an anarchist all day long. I fit that mode, because my belief in anarchy is used as a way to upset the system, a way to detract from what has the norms, to create a rebellion, to create a revolution, to get rid of all the issues that we have, and then help guide the new setup. But I don't want to be in an extreme influx state, I guess is the way to say it.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's why traditionally for me, that's where anarchy kind of comes into this. You have to, like, at some point you have to set something up and put it, or you're going to run the same course as when you put a state in place. It'll be the same thing.
Right. Yeah, that's right. If you don't destroy like the system of corporations when you don't have a state, then you're going to have corporations being the state, right? Like, you can't have a right-wing libertarian world. That doesn't work. Like, the companies can't be in charge.
Yep.
You know,
like, think of Fight Club. Like, you know what Fight Club sought out to do, right? Was to destroy debt. That's me. That's how I see anarchy. And I would do the same with a corporation. Like, the goal is, and it's funny, I don't know if you're into superheroes or Marvel or any of that shit or not. Yep. But their most recent show, The Winter Soldier and Falcon, I'm torn, right? Because my political beliefs side with the flag smashers, the anarchists who are basically saying, what the fuck? Why are we displacing all these people? Like, I'm sitting here like, I kind of want them to win. And, you know, I'm rooting for the bad guys.
But they're not the heroes, right?
They're not, you know. And it's funny because even in that dictative a system, right? Like, even as liberal as Marvel can be, I mean, they put a black Captain America in place, which, you know, like in comic books, that's normal, right? Like, I mean, in comic books, they don't see minorities as something you don't put in power. But the show had to address that because of today's current climate, especially in fucking America. Yeah. And it's funny because you root for that too. And you like the guy because the guy basically is saying, hey, I want to be in the best of both worlds. Well, when you say, hey, my political system is over here because I'm telling you that I want the best of both worlds, but I understand their point of view more, and I'm supporting their point of view more than the guys in power. And you're only fucking in power because you all have a lot of money and a lot of government resources to back you up.
Yeah.
There you go. So there's the conundrum I ran into last weekend, you know, while I was watching that show.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I haven't watched any of the Winter Soldier and Falcon yet, but eventually I will. I've been a big comic book fan ever since I was a kid. And then when the movies and everything kind of came out, then you kind of get into it a little bit here and there. I've enjoyed all the movies, but you know, you see there's like a very militaristic or pro-military aspect to a lot of the Marvel stuff. So
there is. And I think if you go back and watch Civil War, and that's why like them picking up that and putting that in the MCU, in my opinion, redeems some of their stuff. Like, and I won't lie, like the capitalist in me absolutely loves Marvel, like off the charts. Like it especially because it's childhood things. I'm seeing things that are being brought to the screen that never would have thought would have happened.
Right.
You know, crazy stuff like that. But the Civil War pits the two together. But again, it still shows a compromise. Whereas I'm very hardened to compromise. Like, to me, compromise is me saying, well, that's my comfort zone. My privilege allows compromise. Whereas a lot of people don't have that. They just don't.
Yeah, that's right. It's much easier to be able to compromise with somebody who's like, got pretty, you know, one-sided views when they don't necessarily harm you as much.
Yep. And I think that's why people have a hard time with Black Lives Matter movement to some extent. Mm-hmm. And they have a hard time with understanding what's truly a riot versus what is expected anger. And I like, so when I tell you I don't usually identify either which way on purpose is because I just tell you this is what I believe in. And then you're just going to label me a leftist. I know it. But it's easier. At least I get to give you my spiel. I get to preach to you a little bit, and that's that's that Christian, you know, upbringing coming back.
That's fair. Yeah. So, what about this book, Work?
All right. So Work, and so okay. So a slight backstory, and everything's a backstory or a tangent with me, just so you know.
Okay.
That's like you can ask Buddy and Hannah. That they'll. I go. You can, if you watch the show actually on YouTube, you can see when I start to go on a rant. I'll start to either overtalk somebody or I'll mute somebody. And then you can see Hannah roll his eyes. It always happens. But I'm the guy, because Hannah's not as passionate. Like he is, but he doesn't get as worked up as I do. I get pretty worked up. So there was a gentleman that was part of our atheist local community, and he was protesting a nativity at one of the city squares. So that's how I got introduced to this guy. Started hanging out with him, but he's pretty cool. He's still conservative as an atheist, so we had lots of dialogue. But he liked to smoke pot, and I like to smoke pot, and we like to eat really good food. So it worked out really well for a while.
There you go.
Then his daughter got brain cancer and was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer. And so then we kind of became closer. We were a support. He would always come to me with his conservative questions, and we would discuss them. Like, he didn't understand trans identity, right? He's like, if you have a penis, you're a guy. If you have a vagina, you're a woman. And it's like, well, it doesn't work like that. Like, let's explain to you the difference between sexual biology and gender identity. We can do that, can't we? Right?
Yeah.
You know, and him and I would argue about that. And he started making enemies in the atheist community with some of the more liberal people like Kelly from, man, I don't even know if she does a show anymore.
Yeah, queer explaining.
Does she still do that? Okay, good.
And their pronouns are they, them now.
Yep. And he had, like, Jeremiah had a really hard time with that. He didn't want to call them they. He didn't want to do it. Was just, and he wanted to argue about it. And I finally just was like, well, come argue with me about it instead of doing it on the internet, you idiot. Like, I will have these conversations with you just because I understand what you're going through to some extent and this and that. Long story short, his daughter passed away. He went through a really hard time. We still hung out, and then he started drifting farther right a little bit more.
Okay.
And he came to me one day and he's like, I think you always think that I'm just this far right person. And I'm like, well, yeah, I kind of do. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I'll be friends with you,
if
but
the shoe
I really
fits.
Yeah. And he goes, well, I'm going to buy you this book, and this book is you. And I was like, oh, okay. And the book, the name is called Work, is literally the name of the book is Work. And it is created, or it is written by collective authors called from CrimethInc, which I did not know at the time anything about them. But essentially, they created the Anarchist Cookbook. They had another book that the Occupy, the Democratic Occupy Democracy or whatever, Occupy Now or whatever it was way back in
Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
A lot of their tactics were taken from a CrimethInc book.
Okay.
About anarchism, and essentially this is an anarchism, co-op. That's to some extent what this is, but there's no membership. Like, you and I can't just say we're a part of it. We just have to act like it and be part of it. So anyway, he, in an effort to determine that he was not like opposed to my belief system, he gave me this book.
Okay.
And I was like, great, I'm going to read it. I like to read, and this one worked out great. I'm a little upset it's not on Audible because I'm more of an audiobook thing, but I'll break tide to read something that it's never going to be on Audible ever. So essentially what they do is CrimethInc. They call themselves it's like an ex-workers collective. So essentially they're in small anarchist collective, and they originally started back in like the late 90s, way back when out in like Oregon on the East Coast or the West Coast.
Okay.
And essentially what they've done is their goal has been to introduce ideas to the public to upset current standards and explain why capitalism fails. Now, I won't tell you capitalism always fails, like they will, and that's part of where we differ in ideology probably a little bit. But the parts of their book is amazing. I mean, and we literally could spend, like, I think we could probably spend 5 to 10 hours tonight to go through the whole book if you wanted. But I did is I
don't quite have that much time.
I took some notes and I was like, let's condense it down. And the stuff I'll talk about is a free PDF online that I'll give you a link to that people can read on their own too.
Okay.
And what it's supposed to do is inspire you. Now, this book is a $12 book. I don't know what shipping is on it because he bought it for me, but it's a $12 book on their website. You are not going to get a book that's 370 pages that cheap almost anywhere that's going to give you this much knowledge. So to kind of go back to where they stand and kind of who they are essentially they're active participants that make up this CrimethInc. And their mindset is essentially a way of life first and foremost rather than an organization. So they don't want to be categorized as an organization. They don't want that in any way, shape, or form. Their goal is to inspire people to be more active, to control their own lives, becoming producers of culture and history instead of passive consumers. Again, this is where I differ a little bit from their ideology because I believe you still can be a passive consumer. But the problem is there's too many of us that are passive consumers. And we'll get into that in a little bit further into the book, right? So they essentially subscribe to the philosophy that they advocate different radical ways that will help other people get rid of essentially taking credit, becoming wealthy off your own works, and creating an anonymous participants that make up a subset culture that can help create revolutionary propaganda to give to people. And that's literally the word that they say. And their ideas come from thought crimes from the George Orwell's book, where he defines the thought crimes. What is it? 1984. 1984. Yeah. There you
go. The book that conservatives constantly misappropriate.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So, the whole origins of me finding that book was somebody giving it to me as a gift, and then I got into it. And within the first chapter, I fall in love with the whole book. And I will tell you, the one downside of the book is they do not focus very heavily on ideas to change society per se. They spend a lot of the book talking about why capitalism ruins everything. like I feel like they should just make their own show instead of Adam ruins everying. We should have capitalism ruins everything.
Capitalism ruins everything.
Which Adam ruins everything talks about.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's kind of the ideology behind the book, right? So that's where the book kind of came from, the origins, and really what it's trying to accomplish. They do offer suggestions, but I'll be honest, I'll give you my opinions, but I'm going to force people to read the book. That's the goal of this. Like, I'm going to break down why capitalism sucks, and I want to force people to buy the book and actually look through what are some solutions to society that we can actually do.
Sounds good.
So the book is essentially broken up into, we'll call it 2 sections, right? The bigger section is essentially called occupation. It's understanding what work is, understanding how the economy is, and understanding what their positions are.
Okay.
Like, what are their positions of middle management, factory worker, self-employment, the sex industry, police and military, which I'm sure you can probably guess what their beliefs are.
Yeah, got some guesses.
Migrant labor, prisoners, unemployment, and homelessness, outside markets. And I'll be honest, they lean pretty vegetarian, veganish. They have not outright said that, but you can tell they lean that way. Whereas that's a point where I differ from. Like, as
a person who eats meat still, I lean that way. Like,
yeah,
it's like, good.
I agree with the principles. I have a hard time bringing myself to that. That point in my life. It's hard, and it's hard. Now, I will tell you that I believe in ethical consumption of meat, and I won't lie and say I always do that. Chicken is the biggest violator. The worst is because it's so healthy for you. That's my biggest violation. I don't spend the $10 a pound to buy the, and I don't care about organic. Let me be frank. I don't give 2 fucks about whether you want to call it organic or not. I don't care. It means nothing to me.
Yeah, it means nothing anyway, right? Like, it's a technical term for different industries, but they don't do, like, it doesn't change what's in the chicken.
Yep. And that's why they talk about ethical farming, right? And actually, my wife and I are on diets right now, calorie counting type diets. So we don't exclude anything. It's just you get X amount of calories and you have to do so much, physical exercise. And it's because I in fairness, gained 15 pounds ish over the pandemic. So I won't lie and say I didn't drink more and sit on my ass up quite a bit because I was really angry I couldn't go do anything because I'm an extrovert from hell. So if there's a party, even if I don't want to go anywhere, Chris is probably going to be there.
Yeah.
I don't like to be alone. There you go. Which is why I probably would work in a commune very fucking well because you've got constant interaction, like that's me,
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, my wife does not want to join a commune. So we'll see. If we get anarchy and we get a revolution, we can upset the society. There you go.
We'll all be joining communes.
Exactly. Yeah. Except for, I'll be honest, I'm probably going to move to the Canadian commune because there's good maple syrup and everybody is extremely polite. Even the racist conservatives, they're still really polite. And And you guys got flannel shirts, and you know how to cut logs, and you know how to weather the winter just like a Michigander, but better. So like, it's a win-win-win for this guy.
There you go. Yeah.
And I'll eat root vegetables. I don't give a shit. Give me, we'll eat potatoes. You know, I'm whatever.
Potatoes are awesome.
I'll eat all that shit. Like, oh, we can only grow potatoes because we're in Canada now. Okay, fine. Put me down.
Sounds good.
The second part of the book talks about how each of the different areas work, like consumption, production, media, how it all kind of bolsters together, why capitalism works, right? You know, like, and we talk about, and again, I know I'm pretty sure you're not a Christian, but I don't want to offend any of your viewers if they are. But if you look at why Christianity rose to popularity and how it spread like a virus and throughout the world and the different points, capitalism has done the same thing. It's exactly the same.
Okay.
And that's like the core essence. The book doesn't want to come out and say your religion is false, but they want to come out and say you should not be shackled by your religion. Your religion helps play into why we remain capitalistic. You know, again, they don't want to tell you your religion's awful because they want everybody to be included. But if your religion is prominent enough that it affects how your whole life works and how you interact with other people, there's a problem. Hence,
there's a reason that Christianity and anti-communism and capitalism all ties into the American identity. Right?
Yep.
Like these things play on each other and help each other.
Yes. And that's, you know, and again, I'll go back to, I don't think I coined the term capitalism ruins and everything, but that's essentially what they're talking about. And that's all these other factors, cultures, subcultures, reformism, you know, crisis, pollution, and they're very pro green energy, but not using it as a capitalistic intent. Like everybody, and this is actually a funny thing that a lot of people don't talk about, right? We're going to move to green energy. Well, what does that mean? Oh, there'll be more jobs. There'll be more of these things. It's perpetuating a capitalistic cycle. That's all this fucking shit is doing. Like, we're not doing green energy because we want to help the planet. That's just a fucking, you know, label we give to it. It's if you can't make money off it, and that's the core principle of this whole book. If you do not financially succeed off this, why do it? And that's what they talk about is that's the disease of capitalism.
Right. Yeah.
That's your core little nugget right there. So I think that sorry, I lost my train of thought. I gotta get excited for a second. But essentially that's what the book is breaking down. The book is breaking down like, let's understand capitalism at its core. Like, we don't have all the answers, but if we can make you mad enough that you no longer want to go to city council and just be like, yeah, I want to be part of city council and I think I'm going to change it from the inside. Like,
right.
I mean, and this is where Hannah and I differ. This is where on the show we sometimes come to aggressive disagreements because he's taken the SLC punk route. I've taken the SLC punk route, but my personal moralistic belief system does not want to go there. And I think the difference between him and I is if it happened where anarchy was going to happen, I will jump first over him. And it's nothing against his moral. It's just everybody has their different opinions, right? I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to jump, like, I'll jump headlong into it. You know, you want my $100,000 house? Let's burn it to the ground. You know,
that's right.
Take it. Oh, you want all my video games? Wait, nobody's going to get video games anymore? Fucking burn them. I don't give a shit. Let's move on. You know, if you took my whiskey away and my marijuana, we might come to blows. That's going to be a little different.
It's a little bit different.
It's a little bit different, you know, but that's something I believe that, again, if we had communes, we could set up, let's make our own distilleries. Do we really need to, I mean, look, I love scotch with a passion. I love scotch. Like, it's my favorite whiskey of all the whiskeys. And I would even go so far as to say scotch is technically not a whiskey. But, I believe that we could have some of these things even in smaller communes through international trade, even intercommunity trade, that we wouldn't have to worry. And I'll tell you what, if I go from 70 brands of scotch down to 4, how much is my life going to be affected by that?
We don't have to destroy things in order to create a new society. We will have to restructure things. We will have to reevaluate our energy use and our resource distribution. but we don't have to destroy things.
Yes. And that's kind of what this book talks about, is that they're not all for destroying things, but they are for making you question in your life what is important and what would be important. So now what they do is then they get into and they talk about these are the 8 core themes throughout the book. And what I'll do is I'm going to give you a highlight of all 8.
Okay.
And then what we could do, I'm just going to read them to you. And then what we could do is go through them and talk about them. And you can ask questions and whatever you want to your heart's content. Sure. So core value 1 is that, and these are myths that we're debunking. I'm sorry. Let me clarify. These are what we're debunking about capitalism. Work is necessary. Work is productive. Work creates wealth. You need to work to make a living. Work is a path to fulfillment. Work instills initiative. Work provides security. And the last one is work teaches responsibility.
Okay. That's interesting. So what was the first one?
Work is necessary.
Okay. So how do they debunk that work is necessary?
So what they do is they say, well, we have to define work first.
Right.
So it's a little catch-22. And that's what they spend the whole first chapter actually doing, is defining what work is, right? So if work is necessary, then what does it produce? What does it create? What is the ultimate goal for the worker, right?
Right.
Work is not necessary because it cannot, unless you can provide benefit to society. Now, there's caveats to that. What does a benefit mean to society, right? Like you and I having a podcast educating people, is that a benefit to society? Probably.
In the current,
you and I would agree, right?
In the current system, it probably is. Yes.
Yeah. in the current system, it is. But again, if we lived in a utopia, would we need to all wax poetic about why we do this? Probably not, because we all would accept this.
Yeah, there would be a slightly different setup. There would be no need to have a counter propaganda type podcast, right?
Yep. And the ideal would be is that the idea with work is work constricts you as an individual so that you cannot pursue what you enjoy. Now, again, there's always caveats to this, and this is kind of where that book doesn't really talk about the nuances, right? If you enjoy raping children, this is not the book for you. This is not what they're talking about in any way, shape, or form. So what work generates is wealth and financial ability, but does it require you to have it equally distributed to benefit everybody's life, right? So work is necessary, but it's only necessary when everybody gets a fair share and everybody gets equal distribution to improve their lives.
Yeah.
And again, this is where we would probably disagree a little bit. They don't really mention drugs, alcohol, or anything like that. But to me, weed is a benefit to my life. I can't sleep as well without it, right? And it's because my mind runs 7,000 miles a minute. I would actually have 4 podcasts right now, like you probably do, if I didn't sleep. But
right.
I do. Yeah, I do have to sleep.
There's definitely like you say, I don't think that they're in a good society. We wouldn't have any restrictions on pot per se, but maybe not as many people would need it, and or maybe we would, and maybe we would that would be one of the jobs that people do, is they would grow weed and they would divide it up and take it to people.
Yeah. And so that's where they say work is necessary for survival.
Counter propaganda. On this, you have the crisis at the border in America. It might not be. Oh, it might not mislead, but it is very quiet since the Democrat got into office.
It has been.
So there's no crisis at the border?
If you look at the U.S. media outlet, there's not one. It's John Oliver and a few of some of the underground magazines are making a point of it. That's it.
Interesting.
So now, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so what do you think of that? Why isn't there a media blitz about the crisis at the border anymore?
Because it was used as a propaganda stunt by the Democratic Party to put Biden in office. That's on a high level, that is what it was, because Biden did not make it a priority, and he still continues to not make it a priority in any way, shape, or form at all. I mean, and he's been called out like in his news conferences. He has been called out. There is media outlets that are calling him out, but nobody's doing anything about it. Like we're out protesting black people being killed on a daily basis, it seems, because cops can't stop killing black people in America. But we also are. There's not enough of us to go down and protest these borders. When are we going to go into these facilities and start killing government officials to say, y'all armed motherfuckers, yeah, you're keeping kids in cages? Like we could. Oh, I bet down the street there's a hotel. Why don't we put these people up? Oh, or why don't we release them back to the public, for fuck's sake? Like, here you go. Let's set you up with government benefits. Here's some money. Well, fuck, give them cash. Don't give me a stimulus. Get anybody that makes over $50,000 a year. Fuck getting a stimulus. Give it to these people at the fucking border and let them goddamn go get apartments and jobs and all these other things. And let's get them their fucking, ability to become U.S. citizens. And it's all, here you go. Now I'm going on my rant, but it's all because Democrats don't actually give a flying fuck about foreigners, and they don't actually want open borders. And they use it as a propaganda set to put a old white ass motherfucker in the White House instead of putting some sort of a semi-educated minority into the White House, which is what should have happened 100 times over. And every one of the candidates that were on the top tier were better than fucking Biden, but the Democrats pushed it. And we're all stuck because of capitalism in this fucking little market to be saying, how do we get rid of this Democratic Party? Because they don't care.
Yeah. And it's always framed as though if you are critical of the Democratic Party, then that must mean you're in favor of the Republicans, or it's your fault that the Republicans are going to win next time. Or, instead of saying that the Democratic Party maybe they should actually do something that actually helps people. And instead of this, whatever status quo nonsense and propaganda.
Yep. Now, here's where I'm going to slightly diverge from my statement, right? Because I am a proponent right now of you got to vote Democrat. We had to vote Democrat to get Trump out of office. We had to. Right now, it's a fight with the Senate and the House. We have to fight to get these cocksuckers that are more conservative than the conservative liberals out of office. We have to. Yeah. But here's a dilemma. Nobody has been able to put forth an actual program or an actual way to remove Democrats from enough power to give a third party the actual power it needs to go in and guns blazing. We're stuck. I feel like we are in this is a police state with two very similar police factions.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's almost like because a person lives in a state of perpetual fear of what the worst people are going to do, it makes it impossible to progress.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And we have to we had to get Trump out of office. We had to, and we all knew Biden's not going to come in and do anything. Okay, we analyzed his gun control policy that he proposed, that he's trying to push through. It's okay at best, right? It's okay,
of course.
But what does it not address? Law enforcement. Where's my getting rid of my police state? And I'll be frank. I'm almost past this defund the police thing and saying just fucking abolish the police. Yep. Fuck you. Like, you know what? Why don't we buy everybody in America 3 guns? If you don't own a gun, y'all get 3 fucking guns. And here's ammo for a year. Here you go. Let's take my tax dollars and spend it on that shit. Because you give me 3 guns, I don't know what to do with them. I hate guns. I'll be honest. I don't like guns at all. Like I don't like to shoot guns. None of that at all. It has zero appeal to me. And as much as I hate people and want to see people die to some extent, right, that are in bad positions, I don't want to be the person that has to kill them, right? And I don't truly believe that we should be killing all these people. But sometimes you get to the point, Corey, what do you do? Like, what are we going to do?
Well,
we have no choice.
What do you do? Yeah. What do you do when, just as a random example, Mitch McConnell refuses to do anything ever that is beneficial to anybody except himself. And you can't get people to stop voting him in. What are you supposed to do?
To me, it becomes a violent revolution. That's just my opinion. And this is where like people really degrade me and hate that. I mean, I am an extreme supporter of the BLM movement, and I'm an extreme supporter of what they're calling riots, because it's not a riot.
No.
I don't care. You want to burn a fucking government building down? Fucking burn it down.
Yeah, burn it.
It's a fucking building. You shot somebody. You took somebody's life away. And the girl that got murdered in Ohio, and I've argued, I've lost 10 to 15 friends.
Is that right?
Week. Yeah, because people are like, did you watch the video? Yeah, I fucking watched the video. Well, the cop did what he was trained to do. Well, then the cop was trained wrong. Like, what the fuck do you want me to say? Like, you don't murder a 16-year-old.
They have tasers, right? Like,
yeah. Well, and they're like, well, they're too far away to tase them. Well, walk in faster. You saw her attack somebody else. And this here you go. Here's the perfect example. Nobody knows how to answer this yet. And this is going to be my conservative question of the week on my fucking show this week, right? And I'm going to ask everybody, if I'm in a house, right? If I'm in my house and an intruder breaks in, and I call 911, and I say, I got an intruder in my house trying to steal my stuff. Can you send the police right away? Cops come over. And in my community, they'd be there in 2 minutes because it's very small. Right?
Okay.
And there's not very much territory to cover. It's like, even we only got 2 or 3 cops, there ain't much territory to cover. They're going to be over right away. If that guy comes in and has his hand in his jacket and he's pointing at, like, he's got a gun, and he's like, I got a gun. And I'm sitting here and I have a knife that I use to cut up my tomatoes with and my cucumbers for dinner. And it's sitting next to me. And I've assessed that I'm going to just either die or he doesn't really have a gun. But he's threatening me to take my shit. If I grab that knife and go to attack him and a cop walks in and the first thing they see is me attacking that guy and shoot me dead in my own house, fuck you. That's why we abolish the police. That's why we take the guns from the fucking cops, because they don't actually have the ability to assess a situation in a decent enough time. And I'll tell you what, if that girl who had the knife had killed somebody, but she was the one being bullied and attacked, then we should have a reform for her and help her through the system. But chances are she's been fucking abused and she's been through a broken and degraded system for how many fucking years? And when people bully and people come to your doorstep and they attack you, what do you fucking want them to do? What is wrong with her attacking somebody back?
Nope, exactly.
I don't get it.
No. Fuck all the apologetics. All the people who think that she deserved to be murdered. Fuck all that.
And I just started calling people out and saying that is the most racist piece of shit thing I've seen, and just to friend me. Like, you want to argue with me? I'll argue with you. But I'm going to tell you what, like, I'm not going to take no for an answer, and if you piss me off long enough, I'll just fucking defriend your ass, and I'll take screenshots, and I'll make you a cover story for my podcast. That's how we're popular. But for fuck's sake, you'll become Chris's angry rant for the next week.
There you go, yeah.
Fuck people, man. Like, so let's go back to the border, because that was the original topic. It's right. The anger is still there. We still have children in cages. We are still separating people. Is Biden doing a better job? I don't know. Is there people on the ground doing a little bit better job? Yes. He is trying to create it. Is it going fast enough? No. And the problem I have is we have a crisis right there. And instead of saying this is like a pandemic, we're just treating it like it's an everyday occurrence. And that what Trump did was not that big of a deal. We're going to correct it. It's like, we can't wait this long. You should be creating circumstances. I don't give a shit. Create executive orders. Like, I'm anti-executive orders to some extent, but at this fucking point, I've got a crisis and no one's taking care of it. Right. I've got a crisis. Black people are being murdered by cops on a daily basis and no one's taking care of it. Where the fuck are my taxes going? I don't need you to go to Syria and bomb them.
Nope.
Maybe you should go to Canada. You want to go to Canada and bomb Canada? We'll see what the fuck Canada does, because I bet you they ain't going to take much longer than that. That shit. Jesus. Why the fuck we bomb countries? That's a whole nother tangent.
Yeah, no, that's a whole other thing. Where can people find you?
Well, if you would like to hear more ranting, I try not to monopolize the whole show, and I try to let Buddy, and I bet you if Buddy was on your show, I bet Buddy told you that he's like, yeah, sometimes I probably have a hard time talking on that show. And
I don't recall him mentioning that. But
well, that's good, because sometimes I feel like he might feel like that way, and I feel really bad because he's not as talkative sometimes as Han and I are. and he does not get his passion in as I do all that often. But we do try to give, I try to make sure Buddy and Hannah both get their spotlight. But if you want to find us, we're at cellardoorskeptics.com is our website. It's been recently updated. I don't know how long we're going to keep the fancy website because I had to pay a bunch of money for it. But
oops,
we have that. And you can find us weekly on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We broadcast live at 10 p.m. Eastern time every week. If you join the show and put comments in whatever format, I get them because I use a streaming service that allows that. We will respond to you live on air 100% of the time. And then we also have our podcast on Google Play and iTunes if you want to find it there.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining me. It was
no problem. Hopefully I didn't deter too many of your listeners because of my aggressive rants. You got me in a mood. And then there we go. We're talking about how much you hate capitalism. I'm all for it. Communism for life, baby.
I suspect that any listeners of mine or viewers of mine will be on board with that. So,
well, cool. Well, thank you so much again for having me on. That it has been a wondrous hour and 22 minutes or whatever it's been.
You bet. Thanks very much.
I hope you enjoyed the interview with Chris Tanner. For the full-length interview, you can find that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist. And if you don't want to become a patron or can't afford to be a patron, then just email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com and put the episode number in the subject headline and just let me know in the body of the text that or the email that you would like the audio or video link. With that out of the way, here is the next segment of Red Reviews with Justin Clark. Hi and welcome to Red Reviews number 5 with Justin Clark. So what are we covering today?
Hi, Corey. It's good to be back again doing Red Reviews. I'm happy we've hit the sort of 5 mark,
Yeah.
And it's nice to be able to have this kind of recurring thing that I do because I love doing it. So thank you. But yeah, so today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite sort of current events, public policy books I've read in the last couple of years. And it's a book called The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. Right. By Stephanie Kelton. And just to give your listeners some background, so Stephanie Kelton is one of the leading authorities on modern monetary theory, or MMT for short. She worked for Bernie Sanders on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee back in 2015, and she worked on Bernie Sanders's 2016 and 2020 campaigns as an economic advisor. Okay, and she is the senior fellow at the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis and a professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University, and she's done a whole bunch of stuff, and she's pretty amazing. And even though I think in some sense, like who she is as a writer and as an academic is fairly, like, I guess, normie or sort of mainstream, what she's advocating really isn't.
Right. Yeah. It's right away when you say the deficit myth, that goes against the grain of modern, like, political economy stuff.
Yes. Absolutely. And if anybody wants to get sort of a foray into learning more about MMT outside of this conversation, one of my favorite podcasts is a podcast called Citations Needed by Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson, and they critique the media. They did an excellent 2-part episode about deficit fear-mongering that happens within public policy. And that it is, and before we get into sort of what she talks about, the whole deficit stuff is it's far more political than it is economic. And it's really pushed by people who sort of fearmonger about the debt deficits, so that they can do what their ultimate goal is, which is to roll back the social safety net. I mean, their primary goal is to destroy any semblance of social democracy that a society could have. So because they almost never talk about military spending. They almost never talk about tax cuts for the wealthy. They almost never talk about deficit spending to fund wars. They never talk about any of that. So and anytime you'll hear these people talk about, oh, well, we really needed, Obama said this in 2010 himself, I think in his State of the Union address, where he was like, we need to tighten our belts. That was the way he described it.
Every single politician ever says that.
Every single politician ever does that, right? And there's a real reason for that, which is that there's an entire political and economic apparatus that exists to justify that.
Yeah.
And it was largely funded by one asshole whose name is Pete Peterson.
Okay.
Pete Peterson was this wealthy, Wall Street magnate who set up the Pete Peterson Foundation. And this was the guy who sort of got deficit and fear mongering into the public discourse. I mean, if you really look at it, like this kind of discussion about people being afraid of government debt or deficits, like it never really entered the mainstream until about the 1980s. And there's a very deliberate reason for that, which is that it coincides with neoliberalism. It coincides with the destruction of the vestiges of the New Deal. And so, he set up this think tank. I think it's called the Pete Peterson Foundation, and both parties love it. Nancy Pelosi considered him a personal friend, which is no surprise because she was the Democrat in Congress when as Speaker back in 2007, who instituted something called PAYGO, which was that any time that the Congress was going to approve any new spending, it had to be offset either by tax increases or spending cuts somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, you have to have a net zero increase in revenue spending, I guess.
Yes, and that's what PAYGO means. It's a completely arbitrary rule that's undemocratic, that has nothing to do with the electoral process. It's just something that she instituted, largely at the behest of people like Pete Peterson. What Stephanie Kelton does through the book is she lays out some central myths about how the economy works and particularly how monetary policy works. So for those, who are listening, like, what does monetary policy mean? Because it's kind of, it sounds kind of like highfalutin. What does that mean? Basically, it just means, how the money supply is managed within a state. So how much money of a given amount of a given currency is within a state, operating at any given time. What's the relation? And so you have monetary policy, which is, how much money supply is in or out of a system. And then you have what's called fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is basically like your budgets, deficit spending, debt to GDP ratio. So debt to gross domestic product. So how much does an economy produce versus how much it's spending? That's all fiscal policy. And those two things go hand in hand. And modern monetary theory is a new, I think, revolutionary way of looking at those two instruments of government action to really benefit people instead of benefiting, the elites, instead of benefiting financial elites and the military industrial complex and so on and so forth. So the number one myth that she kind of busts in the book, and this is, I think, chapter 1, is she says the federal government should budget like a household. This is something you hear all the time.
Yeah. That's not how anything works, but that's what everybody says.
Exactly. Right. It's like, so you'll hear this all the time. Like I said earlier, Obama said, tighten our belts. You'll hear this all the time, like, oh, we're going to spend ourselves to oblivion. A family couldn't spend like this. You'll also hear this a lot in sort of middle-brow publications like Time Magazine will say, like, okay, well, the federal debt is this much. There are this many people in the United States. Therefore, it's like $300,000 worth of debt to each person. They do this kind of cheap math to make the numbers look crazy.
Yeah.
And the reality is that unlike a household, the federal government issues the currency it spends.
Yep.
So it can just print money. And people always, well, weren't you worried about inflation? Well, inflation largely hasn't been a problem since the 1970s or the early 1980s. It hasn't been a problem because the number one guidepost for modern monetary policy within the global economic system, whether it's the US dollar, or the Chinese yuan or the British pound or the euro, has been to curb inflation. The original goal of monetary policy from the end of World War II to about the 1970s was not curbing inflation. Not really. The primary job was full employment. How can we use monetary and fiscal policy to ensure that the vast majority of people within a society are employed? That was what the goal was. Now, that's not the case at all. And so what does she mean by unlike a household, the federal government issues the currency it spends? So when you are a household and you get a certain amount of dollars in, those are the only dollars you're getting in, right?
Yeah.
Because
you can't magically make more.
You can't magically make more money. The federal government can.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the things I think that's really important when you're talking about the way the federal government actually works. So the traditional way of thinking about how the federal government works, whether it's the United States, Canada is the same way, is that people pay their taxes and the government gets that as like a lump sum and then they spend the money.
Right. That's what people think.
That's what people think because, quite frankly, that's what most people's instincts are. They get income, then they have expenses. That's logical for a household, right?
I don't mean to laugh at it because...
No, it's fine.
That is what people think, and that is an instinct, like it is an intuitive idea. But I've been exposed to enough stuff now that it's like, I realize how absurd it is and how much it's been forced down our throats to believe it. So I don't mean to laugh at people who believe this. I just mean that it is a ridiculous idea.
Because I'm going to be honest with you, like for a long time, I believed that. And quite frankly, there are still pockets of the left who still believe this. Yeah. Who still worry about deficits, who still worry about debt. Like I don't because I know this stuff now.
Right. Yeah.
So let's unpack what she writes about and how the federal government actually works. It's actually completely the other way around. What happens is the federal government spends the money, then they receive money from the public via taxes, and it doesn't really pay for the services. That's not really the goal. No. The goal is to take enough money out of the economy via taxes to ensure that there isn't inflation. Like that's the goal, is to make sure that the economy doesn't get too hot. And you pull that money out to balance it out. That's how it actually works. With that in mind, governments can run deficits all the time. And the United States has run a deficit for most of its existence. And in fact, if you go back to the founding of the fucking country, one of the leaders of deficit spending, the kind of father of someone say a founding father of modern, like sort of fiscal policy where you have deficits and debt was Alexander Hamilton.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, and no, I'm not talking about the shit lib cringe musical. I'm talking about the guy. So, you know, so with Hamilton, he actually talked about a well-regulated national debt can be a blessing. What did he mean by that? What he meant was that if the United States could have and could demonstrate to the world that it could maintain and pay off debt and regulate its debt in a timely manner and show that it had good fiscal policy, meaning that it did run deficits or it did have debt, but it always offset it by either taxes or by spending through the public sector, that it could be fine. And in fact, the reason that the United States had a national debt in the very beginning was because after the Revolutionary War, this stuff's actually not in the book. This is just stuff I know. But after the Revolutionary War, all of the war debts were actually a part of the various former U.S. colonies, the former colonies that became U.S. states. All the war debts were there. And what Alexander Hamilton wanted to do was he wanted the federal government to assume all of those debts in order for in order to create a national debt, to show essentially to the world that, hey, we can take on monetary policy in a substantive way as a state. And so he and Thomas Jefferson reached a sort of grand bargain where the federal government would basically take on all of the states' war debts. In exchange, Thomas Jefferson wanted the nation's capital in the South. And so that was the deal. Okay. Hamilton got the national debt, and Thomas Jefferson got the U.S. Capitol in Virginia, a part of what was Virginia and Maryland. Okay. Okay. And so that was the grand bargain that they struck. So the United States, almost from its inception, has had debt.
Right.
It's never harmed us, ever. The other thing that's really important to understand is it's built into the U.S. Constitution itself. I can't speak for Canada, but I can't speak for the United States. That the United States, the currency of the United States, will always be called what it's called backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. So as long as the federal government maintains its promises to current spending, it can never go insolvent because they issue their own currency and because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. You cannot, a government really can't go in default if it's a national government that issues its own currency.
Yeah.
A state government can go insolvent.
Sure.
A city government can go insolvent because they don't make their own money.
Yeah. They ultimately are answerable to the federal government, right? When it comes to the debt or whatever.
Exactly. And so that's the thing that's really important, is that the way the federal government actually works is they spend the money, they collect enough in taxes to make sure that the system still works and that there isn't too much inflation. That's it. And it's that simple. So that's myth number one. Myth number two is a corollary to that, which is deficits are evidence of overspending. Reality is that for evidence of overspending, look to inflation. This goes back to what I just said earlier.
Right.
If you have a society that has way too much inflation, what's actually happening is that there's way too much overspending by a government without offsetting it in taxes. And so, people always bring up Weimar Germany, like before the Third Reich in the 1920s, right? Oh my God, hyperinflation. The reason they had hyperinflation was because they had to start incurring World War I debts. And they kept paying them and had to deal with the burden of those World War I debts without increasing any taxes, without increasing any government revenues. And that threw the currency completely out of whack because then it became worthless. The same thing can happen in the United States. That's the reason that you're taxed. You're not taxed to necessarily pay for anything. You're taxed to make sure that the spending that the government does not overheat the economy and create inflation. That's why you're taxed, is it pulls money out of the system that has already been spent by the federal government.
Which sort of brings up the question of, well, then why aren't they taxing the super rich more? Right?
Yep.
Because that would offset that spending quite nicely without harming.
Right. And we've just seen in the last couple of weeks since we last recorded this incredible ProPublica report where it showed that the wealthiest Americans pay almost little to nothing in taxes. In one tax filing year, Warren Buffett, the financial magnate and owner of Dairy Queen, which most people don't know, that Berkshire Hathaway, his holding company, owns Dairy Queen. Okay. Which is why I guess like a few years ago they did an ad where he's in it. And
I didn't even know that.
Why is Warren Buffett in an ad for Dairy Queen? And I have to tell people it's because he owns Dairy Queen.
Right.
So Warren Buffett, who always said that like my secretary pays a higher tax rate than I do, which is true.
Yeah.
Because one year he paid 0.1%. 0.10%.
Yeah.
The highest year for any of these tax filings, because ProPublica got these all in a mass. And it's been funny to watch the political class bitch about this because their first issue, a lot of them, is not, hey man, why aren't these billionaires paying taxes? Their actual issue is who leaked this and how do we get them?
Yeah, that's right.
It's, and if they're like that, then you deserve a specific place in hell for having even remotely that thought. But that's Washington brain for you. But anyway, so these people pay almost nothing in taxes, which is why the deficits look so bad, because they don't pay anything. Now, here's the thing. Could the federal government handle it? Yes, it could. And it has. But there are consequences to that, right? So there are real consequences. And this is something she talks about later in the book, where she has a chapter called the Deficits That Actually Matter, where she talks about how the real reason we would want to tax the rich is not so much because we need the revenue from them, because no, the federal government can spend what it spends and then take it in taxes to offset inflation. What it really does is it ensures that the spending that does exist is spending that's bad. So instead of spending, how much would universal college in this country cost per year? It's about $65 billion. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but that's a drop in the bucket, right? I think there was one year recently where the federal government's increase in the discretionary defense budget was $80 billion. And they will approve to that like that. No one cares. No one complains. They just do it. Yeah. Whereas if somebody wants to spend $65 billion a year, again, $15 billion less than just the increase of the federal defense spending budget, which is almost $800 billion, right?
Right.
Then everybody gets pissy. And so that's what she talks about when she's mentioning the deficits that matter, is that like when we don't have these rich people paying higher taxes, when we're not, it basically means we can't spend money on roads. We can't spend money on infrastructure, other infrastructure. We can't work on climate change. We can't work on education. We can't work on housing. We can't work on public health. We can't do any of that because the political elite won't allow it. And the sort of entitled 1% don't pay really any taxes. So the overlays don't, the deficits really only service empire and the wealthy. They don't really service anybody else.
Right.
So there's that. So myth number 3 is one way or another, we're all on the hook. And the reality is, right? And you hear this shit all the time.
That's the same thing as, well, my children are going to have to pay for this in the future, right? That's the same myth.
And it's dumb. It's a bad metaphor. The reality is the national debt poses no financial burden whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly.
So she talks about how, because the U.S. currency is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, there is no absolute need for any individual person to feel like they're burdened by the national debt.
Right.
And to really call it the national debt is a bit of a misnomer. And that gets into into myth number 4, which is that government deficits crowd out private investment and make us poorer. The reality is that fiscal deficits increase our wealth and collective savings. So what does that deficit mean, right? If a government has a deficit. So let's say the federal government spends $3 trillion,
right?
But they only take in $2 trillion worth of tax revenue.
Okay.
That means there is a $1 trillion deficit. And you add that over time, people call that the national debt.
Right.
Well, how does the federal government fund this? Well, they do it through what are called government bonds. Right. Government bonds are different from stocks in that they're not for private corporations, they're for the government. So the government issues savings bonds that people can then purchase that they will get an annual return on. So the national debt isn't really a national debt. It's more like a government bond. It's more like a government bond surplus or a government bond holdings. Right. So when people say the national debt is $20 billion, that's not really what it is. It's actually $20 billion in government bonds that people own and then constantly receive an annual return on. Right. Because again, you have the full faith and credit of the United States. The United States will only crumble and financially will fall apart if the federal government chooses to let that happen. Right? Or there's like some kind of revolution or something like that, right? Or some coup or like whatever. But like in general, the fiscal policy will always work. And so what does she mean by fiscal deficits increase our wealth and collective savings? Well, just that. If you have all these people holding government bonds, they're all making money on them. People love government bonds.
Yep.
When people bitch about, China owns government bonds, well, fine. Then we could change. Who gives a shit? Because here's the thing. When the government has a $1 trillion deficit, what that means effectively is that the federal government is making a conscious decision to put a $1 trillion investment into the private sector. It's making the choice to say, we're going to let society keep $1 trillion. So it's not really a debt. It's more like, it's really more like we're letting them keep the $20 trillion over the last 100 years or whatever, or the last 270 years of the existence of the United States. Right. We're letting the $20 trillion stay in the economy, whether it's the U.S. economy or the world economy globally.
In a real sense, it, like you say, it strengthens the economy because there's more money flowing through the economy in that way.
Bingo. It's just like me here's where it is kind of like an individual thing. One of the things you'll notice is that when the United States can back up its obligations, which it almost always does, like that, and the reason it can is precisely because the U.S. economy functions largely pretty well. Now, obviously, we have problems of inequality, and like we can talk about that. But on a fiscal policy notion, right? Like the federal government can have trillions come in and can have trillions come out, and it's not a problem because the federal government and because the United States economy is so strong.
Right.
And so, you know, that just means that we get to keep more money in our pockets. And so government deficits finance all kinds of shit, whether it's Social Security, making sure that, you know, our retirees get their hard-earned benefits, or Medicare, Medicaid, public works, infrastructure.
That's one of those things that even before I learned much about this, I always thought the idea that the government could put money into the hands of people stimulates the economy. So why aren't we, you know, alleviating taxes on the working people and stimulating the economy in that way instead of, you know, taxing? And we could tax more wealthy people who end up sitting on their money and it's not flowing through the economy.
Yeah, because that's it, right? I mean, the people who are the ultra wealthy. So, for example, like, you know, Jeff Bezos is worth what, $150 billion or some shit like that?
Some silly number.
I want people to understand that $1 billion is 1,000. It's 1,000.
Yeah.
Billing with a B, Carl Sagan B. It is 1,000 million. That's what it is. So imagine somebody who has $1,000 million. Now, that's just 1 billion.
Yeah.
Now imagine being as wealthy as Jeff Bezos. That means he has $1 million 150,000 times over.
Yeah.
That's what that means. No one on fucking planet Earth could spend that much money. No one individual person could.
Yeah.
Only governments could. Okay?
Yeah, that's right.
And so that's part of the reason why do we let these people hoard so much wealth? Because the money does nothing. I mean, it truly does almost nothing. And so because it almost does nothing, because all it's just is stagnating, right? Or it's just making more money. And that's all it does. It doesn't really add any real productive value into the economy, which is part of the reason why people say, why should we tax them? We should tax them because they've been the beneficiaries of a system.
Yeah.
You know, I remember when Obama ran in 2012, that was the whole thing about how, like, he said, like, you didn't build that. And it's like, true, you didn't.
Right.
Like, workers built this fucking country.
And Fox News lost their goddamn minds.
They lost their fucking minds. And that nasty woman, Michelle Malkin, wrote that book about, like, you know, about, like, we did build it and this and that and the other.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, like, again, the federal government will always meet its obligations so long as the currency is in the position that it's in. The United States, people don't realize, like, the United States is what's called the global reserve currency, or the GRC. Now, some of that's going to change. I mean, some of that's already changing. I mean, if you look at Russia, for example, Russia has recently decided to no longer keep reserves of U.S. dollars.
Okay.
Its plan now is to keep reserves of the euro and the Chinese yuan.
Yep. Yeah. I was going to say,
right.
The Chinese currency is going to be the big one at some point, right?
Yeah. And here's the thing. I'm not a big Putin guy, but Putin was pretty goddamn candid when he said, when we need a new bridge in Russia, we just print the money to do it and it's made.
Yeah.
It's that simple. I mean, it truly is that simple. And that's how the Chinese government works. I mean, the major Chinese banks are publicly owned. And so the fiscal policy goes hand in hand with the monetary policy that's instituted by the CCP.
Right.
And you can critique the Chinese system all you want. I'm fine with that. But what I'm saying is that, like, if you want to talk about how monetary and fiscal policy is used, in my opinion, Chinese system uses it better for its people than we do.
I absolutely would have to agree with that.
I mean, if we're just going to go on a pure macroeconomic analysis, right?
Yeah.
If you see the massive alleviation of poverty, the growth of the now the largest middle class in the world,
right,
which is now in China. It's not in the United States anymore. And a lot of that was the result of very deliberate public policy by American elites, where they said, we're going to do, permanent normal trade relations with China, which means that China never has to renegotiate its trade deal with us. Mm-hmm. It's a permanent one. And that gets into the myth number 5. The trade deficit means America is losing. This is something you'll hear a lot.
Yeah.
This is something you hear from, obviously we heard it from Donald Trump. Even Bernie said this kind of stuff.
But that's not what a trade deficit means at all.
No, it's not. Reality, America's trade deficit is its stuff surplus. So people think of like the trade deficit as like an actual physical number. Again, they don't, it's part of it's like the media, like again, because most journalists are idiots. I mean, I'm not trying to be rude, but they are. Like most journalists are sort of inquisitive, failed novelists who went to NYU. Like that's who most journalists are. They're not terribly inquisitive or interested. And so most of them don't really know how to write about any of this shit.
Right.
So what does she mean by America's trade deficit is its stuff surplus? That means that, so we have this massive trade deficit with China. What is a trade deficit? It means that you import more than you export. That's what it fucking means.
That's all that it means.
That's all that it means. It's not a number. It's not debt that's sitting anywhere. It's not money that's sitting in a fucking bank. It's a number. It is a number. That's all it is. And it's a number of indicative of the fact that the United States takes in more imports than it exports. That's it. And so when people say, oh God, we have to worry about the trade deficit.
I was just going to say, which when you look at what America produces and what China produces, then of course America has a trade deficit with China.
Yes.
It just has to work that way.
It's obvious because China is the manufacturer of the world.
Yeah.
Which is what the United States was 100 years ago. The United States used to be the world's creditor nation, right? Which means that we were the ones that would provide credit for people. Now we're the world's largest debtor nation, which means that we have a lot of debts, but we also have a lot to benefit from those debts. That's part of economic development. The British Empire went through the same thing. China is now the industrial center of the world.
Yeah.
But even in time, that will change because China is developing. Again, like I said, they now have the largest middle class in the world. They are developing far beyond their initial economic standards of, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's radically different. Yeah. And so the Chinese system will at some point become too prohibitively expensive for the capitalist class. And you see this all the time. Like, look at some of the clothes that you own. I wear a lot of clothes from Old Navy because I'm a tall, fat guy and they make clothes that are pretty affordable for tall, fat guys like me. A lot of the stuff that they have is made in Honduras or it's made in the Philippines. It's not made in China. And there's a reason for that. It's because it is cheaper sometimes to have it in Honduras or the Philippines or Vietnam than it is to have it in China. Because again, China's going on to development. The United States, it's the same thing. Now, one of the things I want to stress that's super important, that the United States moving away from being the industrial center of the world wasn't some natural thing that just happened.
Right.
It was a deliberate policy choice. And it happened over a span of about 40 years, and it was neoliberalism. So it was the emergence of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, which is the Central American Free Trade Agreement, permanent normal trade relations with China, which was signed in 2001, which has led to a massive steep decline in industrial production in the United States.
Right.
The United States doesn't make anything anymore.
Yeah, no.
So that's why we have a trade deficit, is because we are a consumer economy. We don't make stuff, we use stuff. And that's what our economy is built on. And so it's logical that we would have a trade deficit, which is really what she says, a stuff surplus.
Yeah.
So the one that's really important, she kind of leaves the last myth, the most important one, for last. And this is because this is the one that they use to justify this shit, which is that entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare are financially unsustainable. We can't afford them anymore. That's
nonsense.
That's the myth.
It's pure nonsense.
That's total and complete bullshit.
Yeah. It's we can't spend things on making our society better because we can't pay for it, and the deficit is why.
And that's what they use it to justify it, right? Yeah. But again, they never complain when it comes to military spending, when it comes to tax breaks on corporations, and when it, and tax benefits for the wealthy.
Yeah.
Never a problem. No one ever bats an eye. And this is both parties, by the way.
Yeah.
And I imagine
every party in Canada as well.
Yeah. Like the Democratic and Republican Party. I mean, here's the thing. I can't remember exactly who said this, but there was this African socialist leader who once said, the United States is a one-party state, but in true American extravagance, it has two of them.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Which I think is absolutely correct. Yeah. So what is the reality here? And this is what I was saying earlier. As long as the federal government commits to making the payments, it can always afford to support these programs. What matters is our economy's long-run capacity to produce the real goods and services people will need. So as long as we have a vibrant and dynamic economy that works, right, then we can pay for these things. But that's the real problem. Yeah. The real problem is that we're having a government that is basically propping up an economic policy, which is completely unsustainable. When you have a system that is completely built on just financial manipulation and consumerism, you're going to have long-term economic problems. You're going to have employment problems. We're seeing this right now.
Yeah.
Because of the extended unemployment benefits, this is the argument that people use. Because of the extended unemployment benefits, people don't want to go back to work. No, the real reason people don't want to go back to work is because they don't want to endure the bullshit and deal with you as an asshole boss for shit money when they could get that money from the government and not have to deal with your stupid ass. Like, that's the reason, right? Yeah. And so if you just paid people better, and here's the thing, you can, because fiscal policy will allow for it. Because when people make more money, what do? They pay more taxes. It's that simple. Pay more taxes, and then you can pull that out of the money, out of the economy, that currency out of the economy. They spend it. Like, most people, unless you're like a multimillionaire or a billionaire, the vast majority of the people, the income that they have coming in, the vast majority of it, they have it going back out. That's just a fact of life. Most people do that. Most normal humans don't have hordes of wealth that they sit on. And so when people say, oh, well, we can't afford Medicare and Medicaid anymore, Social Security, that's complete horseshit, because they can. And as she says, as long as the federal government commits to making the payments, they can always make the payments. And
that's why no bank will ever turn down a government check.
Yes. And it's part of the reason why Social Security will almost exclusively never go away. Because even if the United States went fucking, I'm serious, like, even if the United States went fucking fascist, Social Security would likely probably stay around. Right. Like, and why is Social Security and Medicare, why are they so successful? Why do they benefit? Why? It's because they're universal programs. Yeah. They benefit everyone. If you're 65 and up or 67 and up, boom, you get Social Security. Everybody does. Yeah. Regardless of income, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of status, everyone gets it. Medicare is exactly the same way. 65, boom, you're on Medicare. Everybody gets it. Yeah. Why is it that these programs have endured? It's precisely because they're universal. Programs like, aid to dependent families and children, what used to be called welfare broadly. The reason they could reform it in the 90s was because it only benefited a section of the country. Now, the way that they sold welfare reform was that it was all of, the Ronald Reagan, the disgusting racist welfare queen thing, right. Which, by the way, if you actually look into, is largely a myth. Yeah. And the woman that he was loosely basing that story on was a white woman. It was not a black woman. Yeah. But everybody knows what that means. When you hear welfare queen, everybody thinks of an obese black woman with like 8 children behind, like extremely racist, disgusting shit.
Because that's the caricature that was portrayed by the media as well as, after Ronald Reagan said it, right?
Yes. And it's something that both political parties bought into.
Yeah.
Even though the vast majority of the people who benefited from welfare in this country were white.
Yeah, of course.
They weren't black.
Of course.
But again, it was because if you could take a program that was not universal, that only benefited a certain subsection of the populace, then you could have people fight over it.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't do that with Social Security. That's part of the reason why when George W. Bush tried to privatize Social Security in the mid-2000s, it failed miserably because the public wouldn't accept it. Right. And they just wouldn't. And so I won't give Democrats that much credit, but thank goodness they won the 2006 midterms, because Social Security might have been privatized, which would have been horrible, right?
Yeah.
Imagine this. George W. Bush was pitching privatization of Social Security, which means basically a 401k account that you would pay into through the government. He pitched this in 2005, the first year of his second term. 3 years later, the fucking economy collapses.
Right.
Imagine if we had privatized Social Security 3 or 4 years before.
Everybody would have lost it.
It would have been horrible.
Yeah.
We might have seen some Mad Max shit in this country. Like,
right.
It would have been truly bad.
Yeah.
So thank goodness that never happened. So again, anytime you hear some asshole talk about how we can't afford Social Security, first off, ask them, why is it no one ever says we can't afford an $800 billion a year military budget? Why is it that no one ever says anything about that?
Yeah.
Or tax breaks for the wealthy? But that's really besides the point. The real point is that, again, as long as the federal government commits to the payments, they can always make them. It doesn't matter.
Right.
And here's another thing about Social Security. You want to make Social Security safe? You want to protect it? One of the little things most people don't know is that if you make over $560,000 in the United States, you no longer pay for Social Security. There's a cap on how much you're paid. So you only pay FICA taxes, which is for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. You only pay FICA taxes up to about $500,000. And then everything after that, any taxable income doesn't go towards Social Security.
Ah.
You want to make Social Security solvent? You get rid of the cap.
Yeah, get rid of that cap.
You make millionaires and billionaires pay for Social Security.
Yeah.
That's how you do it. It's that simple, folks. These are very simple solutions that are not done because the U.S. government is full of corrupt old assholes who are the beneficiaries of the very largesse they receive from the corporate system. That's why it doesn't happen. And so, long story short, the issue is that deficits don't matter. So deficits and debt don't matter. The real thing about the economy is whether or not it can actually produce for its citizens. And in that regard, the United States fails a lot. Because we do have real deficits, like I mentioned earlier, and she describes in the book about we have real deficits in education, housing, climate change, healthcare, food, security, all of it. We all have these problems. And so, if the United States really wanted to reform itself and become an economy that worked for everyone, the way you would do it is through reconfiguring the U.S. economy to not favor just cheap consumerism and financialization. You would build an economy that was focused far more on you would build an economy that was built on robust public benefits. This is where I agree with I'm farther to the left than Stephanie Kelton. I'm a communist. So, I've accepted that that's what I am. I'm a Marxist. I'm a communist. So my argument would be if you wanted to take her ideas even further, because I think MMT is great. And I think you can actually meld MMT with Marxism really well. I think they actually really gel. Although don't tell some Trotskyists that because they don't believe that. And I love my Trotskyist friends. I love Trotsky.
Of course.
It's fine. But they don't. And they have good arguments against it.
Yep.
They really do. There's I think it was from, the International Marxist Tendency. I think they did a podcast. One of their economic writers did a podcast that was a Marxist sort of Trotskyist critique of MMT.
Okay.
I think their podcast is called Socialist Appeal or Marxist Voice or something like that. If you want to hear a Marxist perspective of MMT that's critical of it, that's where to go.
Okay.
But a lot of Marxists are pretty open about they like this. Isha of the Historically podcast is really big about MMT. I'm very big about the MMT. Because it's a policy choice that can be done. Now, does MMT have real problems with it? Of course, because MMT itself is predicated on imperialism. It's kind of the one problem with it, is that why is it the United States can have the sort of big, wealthy, robust country it has? It's because it extracts wealth from the global south, right?
Yeah.
So you need to think, so that's one of the things you have to think about. But overall, if we're just thinking about domestic policy, this is one thing that can really change things and really benefit people. There's one thing I also wanted to mention about sort of the international component about this. One thing that I think is really important, and this is an example she talks about in the book, is the country of Greece. Mm-hmm. So Greece, about, 10 so years ago, obviously had a massive economic downturn that led to a full-blown debt crisis, and which has led to incredible amounts of mass suffering. I think in 2015, the Syriza government, which was a left-wing government, was elected in Greece. It was elected on an explicit anti-austerity platform. So it was going to fight back against the Troika, which was the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the European central government, right? And the problem was that because Greece no longer had its own currency, which I think is called the drachma, it was on the euro, it no longer could set its own fiscal policy and monetary policy. Just couldn't. And so it was at the whim of the euro. It was at the whim of the eurozone. It could not really set its own course. By contrast, if you look at a country like Russia, which I think is, it has the ruble, it sets its own monetary policy. China sets its own monetary policy. England, smartly enough, even though it was a member of the EU, kept its own currency. Because ultimately, the European Union exists. I'm going to say this. It's going to be a little bit controversial, but I think it's true. The European Union achieved what Hitler could have only dreamed of, which is a united Europe under the thumb of Germany. And because if you think about it, the monetary policy of the European Union is basically created by Germany because it's where the European Central Bank is. Monetary policy is pretty much set there, and it's also the economic powerhouse of Europe. And so, whatever Germany wants, Germany gets. And so, if Germany wants brutal austerity programs in Greece, it got them, and that's exactly what happened. Yeah. Even though there was a public referendum in Greece to basically say we reject the austerity measures of the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. The Syriza government, which is a left-wing socialist government elected against austerity, caved and supported the austerity plan because they had no choice. Yeah. This is part of the reason why I think one of the ways that the world could be a lot better off. And this is why Brexit was such a terrible thing, because it was the right policy for the wrong reasons. There are really good left-wing arguments for why countries should leave the European Union. Right. The European Union is a disgusting, corrupt, neoliberal shithole of a system that most people shouldn't be involved in. And it was sold on the idea that if everybody had the same currency, that it would be easier. Actually, it's made things a lot fucking harder for most countries. Right. It's kept the poor countries poor and the rich countries rich, and the rich countries have pretty much total and complete control over whatever the poor countries want to do because they're all in the same currency. Yeah. And so if Greece wasn't like that and they kept their own currency, they wouldn't have had the monetary problems they ended up having. Yeah. So I think the European Union sucks. And although I will say this, would I have supported Brexit? No, because again, the policy itself, the reasons were bad. It wasn't like we don't have any say, we can't set fair trade deals, we can't do better monetary. It wasn't rooted in an actual we care about people. It was more of we want to keep the brown people out. That was essentially the argument.
Right. And like you said, Great Britain kept their own currency, and they weren't one of the poor countries that was dictated to the way that Greece would have been.
And they set their own policy. I mean, essentially, they got to set their own monetary policy. Yeah. Their fiscal policy was still hampered a bit by whatever because they had to pay into the European system, the European Union government. They had to send representatives. They had to have that. But their monetary policy was on their own, which is exactly that's how the European Union should have been set up from the get-go.
Right, yeah.
Which is what it was before it became the European Union. It was the European Economic Agreement or something like that. And before then, people had their own currencies, but they were all tied together with trade routes and immigration, which is what it should be. That's what the European Union should be. Governments should have their own monetary policy. They shouldn't let their monetary policy be dictated to them by Germans.
I guess, what were we doing? Were we doing a star rating or just a recommendation?
I would recommend it. I think I gave it maybe 4 or 5 stars in Goodreads. I highly recommend people read it. It will bust a lot of myths about how the economy actually works. And even though it's a book that's very sort of set on the U.S., it's very applicable to other countries, as we've sort of discussed in our discussion of Greece and other places. Yeah.
No, that's great. And where can people find your content?
Sure. So you can check out my website, justinclark.org, where I keep some of my writing and my other public history work. You can follow me on Instagram at justinclarkph. And also, please check out some of my recent publications. I wrote an article about Lenin and religion for Midwestern Marx. You can check that out, I think, midwesternmarx.org or .com. And then I recently wrote an article about Robert Ingersoll and my thesis subject, who was a 19th century free thought order, wrote an article about him and the Christian novelist Lew Wallace for the Truth Seeker magazine. And so that's also available on my website. You can read all that there too.
Awesome. And I think I posted links to a couple of your articles in the show notes for the last one, and I will continue to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun. And I promise we'll try to do these shorter next time.
That's all right.
That's all, folks. Thanks for listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work so that I don't have to work as many hours at gig jobs. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send me money on PayPal at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out my link tree at linktr.ee/skepticalcorey. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, and From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, or you can send me a friend request at facebook.com/CJBrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. You can also email me at themindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening or watching, and remember, the truth leans left.
I think that's it.